Texas was once a Spanish colony that became its own country. It then became a U.S. state, only to soon turn around and go to war with D.C. How did this happen, and why is its history full of myths? To find out, join me in this brief look at the history and politics of Texas. We do not know with certainty when people first came to inhabit what we now call Texas, although historians estimate it was at least 14,000 years ago. We do know that by around 1500 AD, Texas was sparsely populated and divided into at least 4 distinct cultural regions, which in turn were made up of smaller villages or tribes. These were the southeastern, Gulf, Puebloan, and Plains cultures. Among the many tribes we can mention within these groupings are the Jumanos in the Puebloan region, Comanches and Apaches in the Plains, Karankawas in the Gulf, and Caddos in the southeast. Their lifestyles ranged from nomadic for the Comanches, Karankawas, and Apaches to the sedentary for the Caddos and Jumanos. For the latter, this meant a lifestyle that depended on the growing of corn, squash, beans, and particularly for the Caddos, the building of earthwork platform mounds. For the Karankawas, this translated to a lifestyle that moved seasonally to hunt wild game, fish, and collect wild plants, while for the Plains people, it meant a life that depended almost entirely on the hunting of bisons, and thus had to follow them across the plains. This, in turn, brought them in conflict with other more settled tribes or those who they competed with for resources, a definite feature of their relationship with others. The Karankawa were the first people to encounter the Europeans, although the Spanish had sailed the Gulf Coast a few years earlier. This was when the remnants of the failed Pánfilo de Narváez expedition washed ashore somewhere near present-day Galveston in 1528. Originally, there had been around 80 survivors, but soon their numbers began to dwindle as a result of disease and starvation. Decimated and weak, the local tribes enslaved them for several years until there were only 4 of them left, including Alvar Núñez Cabeza de Vaca, one of the original leaders of the expedition, and Estebanico, a black man who had once been enslaved by the Spanish. The 4 men managed to escape west and then turned south to Sinaloa, where they encountered other Spanish, becoming the first non-natives to traverse Texas and the larger Southwest. Cabeza de Vaca would write about the experience, which increased the interest of the Spanish in the area. Still, it took until the 1680s when the French, under the leadership of Sieur de la Salle, attempted to establish a colony at Matagorda Bay for the Spanish to make colonization of the area a priority. There would eventually be over 30 missions and forts, or presidios, built in Texas, including in what is now San Antonio and El Paso. The heyday of the Texas mission system was from 1745 to 1775, when it officially became an interior province of the Viceroyalty of New Spain. But despite its success, the colony was never more than a border area that had way more military expenditures and revenues. This was in part because of its low population, which in turn had a lot to do not just with the little gold and silver the Spanish had found, but also the hostile nomadic population, which compared to the indigenous peoples the Europeans encountered further south, had a huge advantage: horses. The animals were crucial because it not only made indigenous attacks more fearsome, but nomadic peoples as a whole much harder to enslave or even forcibly pacify. Beyond attacks by nomadic peoples like the Apache and Comanche, the frontier also created border disputes, first with French Louisiana and later, when this was sold to the Americans in 1803, with the United States. This became even more of a problem when Napoleon invaded Spain and appended a Spanish authority, leading to insurgencies all over Spanish America, including Texas, given that unlike many comparable faraway provinces, rebels had an international border they could easily get weapons from. Thus, not surprisingly, Texas had multiple rebellions, including one in 1812 led by Bernardo Gutiérrez de Lara that called itself the Republican Army of the North, and one in 1816 where a new republic was instituted at Galveston Island. The rebellions were crushed though, and by 1819 Spain thought it had solved its Texas border problem when it signed the Adams-Onís Treaty, which gave up Florida, but in theory secured a clear border between New Spain and the U.S. It didn't, of course. Only a few months later, there was another American expedition, this one led by the Virginian James Long, which teamed up with local rebels and declared Texas independent. That rebellion failed too, but only 2 years later, New Spain as a whole declared itself independent under Agustín de Iturbide. Texas was now part of Mexico under a federal republic in a new state called Coahuila y Texas. Still worried about American expansionism, the Mexican government decided to allow American migration to Texas with the condition that Americans followed the law and did not bring enslaved people to Mexican territory. Soon, there were several colonies numbering in the thousands of people that came to be called Texians. The first was led by Stephen Austin in 1821. Texians, however, chafed at the restrictions on slavery, tariffs, and other decisions from Mexico City. It didn't help that Mexico was under constant political turmoil. In 1833, Stephen Austin traveled to Mexico City to plead the settlers' case and tried to have Texas be its own state, separate from Coahuila, but instead was arrested accused of fomenting insurrection. When yet another coup brought Lopez de Santa Anna to power and the new government opted for radical centralization, another insurrection erupted on October 2, 1835. The Texas War of Independence had begun. At the outbreak of the war, Texian troops, composed of Americans, Mexicans, and a fair number of English, Irish, Scottish, Germans, and other European settlers, captured San Antonio and occupied and further fortified the Alamo, an early mission originally constructed to convert to Christianity the local indigenous people. The site would soon be the stage for the most famous battle in Texas history. This began on February 3, 1836, when Lopez de Santa Anna placed the mission under siege. Now the source of many myths, most of which have little basis in reality. What is true is that the Mexican troops routed the place, and the cruelty of the siege galvanized those who supported Texas independence with the cry of "Remember the Alamo." For several months afterwards, the Texian cause looked lost, as Mexican troops won 2 more battles in Coleto and Refugio, carried out a massacre at Goliad, and kept advancing as the Texian forces retreated. Fortunately for them, however, Santa Anna then committed a huge blunder at the Battle of San Jacinto. He picked the worst possible place to camp, one where his army could be easily caught off guard, something the Texians took advantage of to slaughter a huge part of the Mexican army. Mexico never recognized the breakaway republic, especially because Texas claimed the Rio Grande as its border, while Mexicans insisted it was the Rio Nueces. Mexico was too weak to reconquer the country, so Texas remained de facto independent, but Mexican troops invaded multiple times. The Comanche didn't recognize Texas either, obviously, and they kept raiding the western settlements. The combination of these two not only depressed the Texas economy, as fewer investments and migration occurred than otherwise would have, but even worse, it meant that the Texas government promptly accumulated a huge debt trying to keep a suitable army. Still, Texas managed to achieve international recognition by the US, France, Belgium, and the Netherlands, found the University of Baylor, changed its capital to Austin from Houston in 1839, and managed to hold regular elections. Given the circumstances at the time, the main debate was between those who wanted annexation to the United States and those who found it unnecessary and thought they could expand their domains all the way to the Pacific. In the end, the debt and potential war with Mexico was too much, and a secret negotiation between Sam Houston and President Tyler ended with the annexation of Texas to the United States on December 29, 1845. This in turn paved the way for a war with Mexico over the disputed strip between the Nueces River and the Rio Grande. That war ended conclusively the threat from Mexico and contested claims in its southern border, but it did not solve its west or northern ones, which became entangled within the larger free state versus slave state conflict at the time. In the end, this was solved with the Compromise of 1850, where Texas gave up its western and northern claims to the U.S. in exchange for $10 million. Statehood was good for the economy of Texas, as it solved its debt problem and encouraged more migration, which swelled the state population to over 210,000 by 1850, a tripling of its 1840 population. A significant portion of these migrants were Germans, people who would leave a lasting impact in Texan culture with the introduction of the accordion and would later be an important Unionist group within the state, a subset of whom the Confederates would massacre on the banks of the Nueces River when they tried to flee for Unionist territory in August 1862. Another relevant subset of the population were unwilling newcomers, that is, enslaved blacks, which made up about 30% of the population and concentrated in the cotton-producing areas of the eastern part of the state. Slavery had been central to the Texan political identity. The right to own enslaved people had not only caused a lot of the conflict with Mexico, but when it became a republic, Texans made it a constitutional right, one that could never be changed by Congress in any way. In fact, an enslaver could not even choose to free anyone without the consent of Congress, and free black people were banned from taking residence in the new republic. Thus, not surprisingly, when Lincoln was elected American president in 1860, calls for secession hit a fever pitch in the state. It still took several months for it to happen, mostly because of the opposition of the strongly pro-unionist governor, Sam Houston, but secession still came. Texas declared it was leaving the Union on February 1, 1861, and a month later, on March 2nd, joined the Confederacy. Soon, it would be involved in the most destructive war in American history. The state had over 70,000 of its men fight on the Confederate side, although it had relatively few casualties, about 3,000, and suffered relatively little as most of the fighting in the state was limited to skirmishes, especially over the attempted Galveston blockade. Beyond that, the state's main contribution to the war effort was supplying cattle, which paved the way for ranching and cattle production to become big business in postbellum Texas. This in turn necessitated cattle drives, the herding of longhorn steer to northern markets, which became famous as part of the Texas cowboy myth, although in real life the cattle drive days barely lasted 2 decades. In the meantime, the event that marked the end of the war in Texas was the arrival of Union forces to Galveston in June 1865, where Major General Gordon Granger proceeded to publicly read the Emancipation Proclamation, declaring that all enslaved people were now free. Now celebrated as Juneteenth, this marked the beginning of an all-too-brief moment when black people had significant power in the state. That's because they were part of a coalition of abolitionists and radical Republicans, like Senator Morgan C. Hamilton, that ran the place in the immediate aftermath of the war. It didn't last, however. An immediate backlash followed. Within the Republican Party, an anti-black movement known as the Lily White Movement developed, and Democrats started to win elections. By the 1870s, the Democrats were back in charge and would gradually and systematically curb the rights of African Americans from voting to the places they could work and live. Known as Jim Crow laws, these included poll taxes, first introduced in 1876, the banning of marriage between blacks and whites, instituted in 1915, the segregation of schools, enacted in 1925, and so on. These laws often did not specifically single out Mexicans or Hispanics, but nonetheless created the conditions for discrimination against them too, especially when it came to schools, which were just as segregated as those intended for black students. Throughout this period, Mexicans and African Americans also had to worry about lynching, sometimes even by law enforcement, as it happened in 1915 when the Texas Rangers lynched 5 Mexican men, including Pascual Orozco, a prominent leader in the Mexican Revolution of 1910. Jim Crow laws would eventually be dismantled in the 1950s and 1960s, but their legacy extends to the present day. At roughly the same time after the war, the Texas economy boomed. First from primary products like cattle, cotton, and lumber, and then from oil. Texans had been drilling for the black stuff for decades, but things really got going on January 10, 1901, when a drilling site at Spindletop, east of Houston in Beaumont, pierced a salt dome, setting forth a gusher of oil so powerful that it took days to bring it under control. Spindletop began producing an estimated 80,000 barrels of oil per day. As automobiles and railroads turned to the oil industry for fuel, discoveries of black gold financed the construction of much of modern Texas and created the image of the nouveau riche Texan in popular culture. The Great Depression put an end to the good times, at least temporarily, and while the Texas unemployment rate was better than nationwide's 25%, there was plenty of economic pain in the state. This was especially so when the economic fallout was coupled with the Dust Bowl, a period of severe drought that created such massive dust storms that they blocked the sun for hours and made life in the Texas Panhandle all but impossible. It took U.S. participation in World War II to put the Texas economy back on track. With its long coastline, oil reserves, and abundant land, Texas was ideally situated for war-related industrial and military facilities. New industries emerged, luring large numbers of people to the state and enticing rural residents into rapidly growing urban centers. More than 1.2 million troops, many from outside the state, trained for services at bases and camps in Texas. The boom continued after the war, as did the state's population growth. Texas had doubled its inhabitants from 3 million to over 6 million between 1900 and 1940, doubled it again to 14 million by 1980, and then once more to 28.3 million by 2017. Today, it is the second state with the most people in the country. Not bad for a place that began as a sparsely populated province. Meanwhile, politically the state was dominated by conservative Democrats for over 100 years. Between 1876 and 1961, there was not a single Republican governor, senator, lieutenant governor, or attorney general from Texas, and only a handful of House representatives. During this era, Democrats sent the first woman elected to Congress from Texas, Lyra Miller Thomas, and of course, the first president, Lyndon B. Johnson. Incidentally, it was LBJ's experience as a teacher in a segregated school for Mexican children in Cotulla, Texas, that inspired his civil rights and Great Society policies in the 1960s. At the presidential level, it was more competitive. Eisenhower won the state twice, for instance, and Kennedy barely prevailed in 1960 versus Nixon. In fact, the reason why Kennedy was in Dallas on the day of his assassination was precisely so he could consolidate the support he would need in a crucial battleground state. Instead, Texas would be the last thing he would see in his life. This all began to change very slowly around that time, but not fast enough for the two Bushes, future presidents from Texas, who both lost elections in 1964 and 1978 respectively. It took until the 1990s for the trend to accelerate. Since 1994, the year of the so-called Republican Revolution, it has been nothing but GOP. 1994 was the year that George W. Bush won the governorship of Texas, setting him up for his presidential run in 2000. Since then, the closest the Democrats have come to winning the governorship was 2006, when Chris Bell lost to Rick Perry by around 9 points. For the Senate, it was 2018, when Ted Cruz eked out a 2-point win against Beto O'Rourke. In the 1990s, there was also another event in Texas with nationwide political repercussions. This was the 1993 Waco siege, a law enforcement raid carried out by local and federal forces which ended up killing 95 people, including children. The trouble began when the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms concluded that a religious group that called itself the Branch Davidians were hoarding illegal weapons at their compound in Mount Carmel. There were also suspicions that the leader of the group had committed statutory rape with the multiple children brides he had taken. When the ATF attempted to serve a warrant at the ranch, a gunfight erupted where multiple federal agents died. This is what prompted the 51-day siege, which in turn culminated with a raid and a fire that ended up killing the majority of the Branch Davidians that were at the compound. The botched raid, bad decision-making by the feds, and subsequent tragedy energized a modern militia movement and radicalized a number of people, including Timothy McVeigh, who specifically drove to Waco to show his support for the Branch Davidians, and would later time his bombing of the Oklahoma City Federal Building, the worst terrorist attack in American history up to that point, to coincide with the 2-year anniversary of the Waco siege. From the mid-20th century on, Texas also continued to industrialize and diversify its economy, expanding into petrochemicals, pharmaceuticals, and later into electronics. In the 1950s, it was here that Texas Instruments, a corporation headquartered in Dallas, invented the first silicon transistor and integrated circuit. The same company also designed the handheld calculator and the single-chip microcomputer in the 1960s. Today, Texas has 50 Fortune 500 companies headquartered in the state, a big reason why it has the second largest economy in the country, just below California's. Part of the appeal for companies is that Texas is one of 8 states that has no income tax and also prohibits cities or counties from imposing one. This, not coincidentally, does not mean that Texas has few poor people. On the contrary, the poverty rate in the state has historically been higher than that of the United States as a whole, and as of 2019, placed it as the 11th worst state, with 13.6% of its people living below the poverty line. This is especially so along the U.S.-Mexico border, where decades of neglect have made many of those counties some of the poorest in the country. Brooks County, for instance, which has Falfurrias as its county seat, has a whopping 41% of its people living below the poverty line. Poverty is not the only challenge the state has historically faced. Natural disasters have also been a constant over time. The state has experienced 3 of the top 15 costliest hurricanes in American history: Harvey, Ike, and Rita. In 2017, 2008, and 2004, respectively. Also, the deadliest, Galveston in 1900. This last one killed around 8,000 people, which also makes it the natural disaster with the most deaths in American history, not just Texas. The hurricane single-handedly ended Galveston's golden age and shifted capital and population to Houston. More recently, a 2016 storm produced so much rain as it stalled over Houston that it killed 5 people and produced $2.7 billion in damage. Likewise, in 2021, 3 major winter storms caused the worst infrastructure failure in Texas history, which in turn led to the deaths of at least 300 people. And of course, tornadoes are a perpetual problem. The deadliest touched down in Waco in May 1953, killing 114 people and injuring 597. It is unclear to what extent this vulnerability to natural disasters has increased the state government's preparedness plan. Experts worry this could be much worse next time. Texas outgrew its status as a sparsely populated buffer province long ago. Its Spanish, Jim Crow, ranching, distrust of central government, and oil production legacy, however, weigh heavily in its present and interact to make what Texas is today. The extent to which this might change in the future will be up to Texans to decide.